We're going to get a little more serious, I think, about why we're here. That's what I want to talk about. Why we're here and what our future is in that regard. So, this out, and should be able to talk to regard. That would be me. There we go. So what I want to talk about are ragtime revivals, the past, the present, the future. And many of you have been involved with this, but I'm also going to want input. So later on in this, we're going to try and see what we can get to how we can keep this music relevant, alive, make it more famous. So ragtime is dead. Long live ragtime. It's been one of my keywords for a long time, that one. We're going to go back to what happened. Why did it die in the 1930s? This is the Great Depression. Tastes were changing in what people were listening to. Radio replaced record and sheet music. This is important in that if you had a radio, once you've done that expense, you don't have to pay for any of the software for the hardware, for the records. You didn't have to buy the sheet music. You let people do the work for you. And radio, although it was essential, you were limited into what you heard, which in the early 30s was usually live broadcasts if it was music. And later in the decade, they started turning to records and transcriptions. But it was going to be current music. And where was that current music coming from? Well, it was, if you're listening to ragtime, it was going to be at Grandma's house. Let's face it. Because she, more so than Grandpa, because a lot of women knew the ragtime music. So period films and cartoons. If you'd see a gangster film showing gangsters of the late teens and the 20s, you might hear some ragtime. There's a famous one, I think it's the Public Enemy. There's a guy in the background sort of trying to play Maple Leaf, but rather unsuccessfully. But it was trends led by music in films. I know Frederick is very familiar with that. Films of the 1930s, composers like Harold Arlen, for example. The popular songs that you heard from these guys, Cheerful Little Earful, and You've Got a Feeling I'm Foolin', whatever. Those types of things began to replace, and that's what you heard on the radio. And it was not ragtime, that was old music. So you began to wonder, why would it ever come back? Because few artists were recording. Dave Jason put out some records in the 1970s of what he could find of recorded ragtime from the 1930s, and there wasn't all that much. Of course, Jelly Roll Morton's going around recording his thing. We don't quite call it ragtime, it's more or less his own genre. But stride piano was an extension of ragtime, but stride piano, again, was also a lot of popular song played in a stride format. So there were social changes, trends with African Americans putting it out of vogue. I've talked to several of them. I know some of you know Reginald Robinson. He put it one way I thought was rather apropos. It says, everything the black people came up with, the white people eventually caught on and stole, more or less. They came up with ragtime. We started playing ragtime. They came up with jazz. We started playing jazz. They did blues. We did blues, and so on. So trends with African Americans, of course, they were gaining more stature, which was good, of course, but they were not looked upon as the stereotypes, and the ragtime had these connotations, these associations with the coon songs and other things, and minstrel shows. So blacks being recorded more, even though there were still race labels. They had labels that were committed more or less to African Americans playing. It was becoming more mainstream, more popular music, especially by the 1940s, and you know that rhythm and blues became rock and roll and so on. So that was one of the trends, the social trends. Well, the first stirrings of new life started to show up in the early 1940s. Jelly Roll Morton died in 1941. That made the news again. People said, oh, Jelly Roll. I remember him back in the day. He was in Los Angeles when he died, but the stories got around. He'd been trying all throughout the late 30s, living in DC, moving to New York, and then back to Los Angeles, making records. He made one last recording session when he was in poor health and probably should not have. And as a result, after he did all that work at Smithsonian, or the Library of Congress, he did a set of recordings with Alan Lomax, which is great, except most of those were not released for up to a decade, and the book on him was not released for a decade. But still, people remember Jelly Roll Morton. But the big deal was in San Francisco. Lou Waters formed the Yerba Buena Jazz Band. And what they were trying to do is get the recordings of the original Dixieland Jazz Band, Louis Armstrong and King Oliver, and not recreate them, but refresh them, do them in a new way. So that started in early 1942, but then, and Wally Rose, what was great is Lou let Wally off the leash. He was a wonderful human being, great pianist, and said, okay, what do you want to do? So he recorded pieces like Black and White Rag and Dill Pickles. And sure, it was doing with the kitschy drums, you know, brick-a-tick-tick, brick-a-tick-a-tick, but they were being recorded again because this is the music Wally grew up with at Grandma's house. But unfortunately, the war came along and interrupted that. And most of these guys got drafted. In fact, there was only, I think, one or two pianists left in San Francisco, Burt Bales being one of them, who 4F'd. And he was no Wally Rose. Burt Bales was definitely an interesting commodity in what he played. Yeah, any opinion? Dave?
Yeah, you get it right on about him and about two others who played in clubs, but they don't attempt to make a name for themselves. So.
Yeah, Lingle didn't go either. Yeah, so Paul Lingle, and he was keeping Ragtime alive a little bit on the radio, but he had such a bombastic style. Most of it was in the clubs where he would go. And the servicemen, and this is, I've talked to a lot of them, including my late dad, and now my late mom, who died this week, but I'd asked her about this and some opinions, and grandparents. So I was talking about this 15 or 20 years ago and trying to figure out what it was that, why did this happen? Well, these servicemen come home, and women have been working for several years now, some of them in the defense industry, and some of them maybe recycling or whatever, but they're in the workplace. We've got highways being built now, bigger highways, and things like supermarkets and suburbs, and these guys come home 46 and 47 to a very different America, a more industrial, but also becoming more gentrified and more heading towards the Eisenhower era. And they didn't find a lot of comfort in the music because when they left, swing was big. The swing era was only 8 years, 1936 to 1944. By the end of the war, swing music was starting to become passé. So, what was the musical center in 1946-47? Some Sinatra, maybe here and there, Mills Brothers, bebop was trying to make inroads, but we didn't really have much of a musical center. But anyway, in 1946, Lou Waters, Wally Rose began recording again Lester Koenig of Good Time Jazz Records, which he had recently formed. And we've got to thank him because he did several series in 1946 of them playing in various dance halls. And we got to hear some great recreations of jazz in higher fidelity than had been done before. But there was, of course, a big technological confluence about to come in 1948. And here's the irony. There was a big musician strike. If it had to do with the recording industry, don't. You can play live on radio or you can play for radio, but some of the record companies weren't playing ball. Capitol Records was one of the first to come around and concede to their wishes because they wanted to get out there again. But this musician strike had more to do with ragtime coming back than you might imagine. And a technological confluence because suddenly we have magnetic recording tape, which had been developed over the past 2 years. And one of the biggest investors in this was a guy who also remembered ragtime. His name was Bing Crosby. Ampex Corporation was made more or less possible by Bing's influence and his financial input. And this was because he wanted his radio shows to sound better and not have mistakes in them, so he could record the rehearsal, record the radio show in advance. In fact, he left NBC Network because they didn't want him to do that. He went to ABC, and he made ABC Radio somewhat famous because they could put his show out, and if something didn't go so well in the actual show, he could take from the rehearsal. So, Bing Crosby, a lot to do with this. Why did this recording strike? Well, because it made, I'm going to get to that in a minute. Making ragtime into literature. It hadn't been. There were a few articles here and there, so-and-so died. But then the book. We all know the book, right? They all played ragtime. Rudy Blesh, Harriet Janice. And there is good and bad attached with this. It was one of the last hurrahs for many of the people who were interviewed for this. Some of them died even before the book came out in late 1949. But at least they were interviewed. And they had selective memories or faulty memories. And Rudy had a certain style. What he put into there was a narrative. And we can't undo the narrative and rewrite the book. It has to be a total new thing. So there were some inaccuracies and perhaps some misconceptions, but it was a great attempt, and it was a nice read, and it got musicians interested. And when musicians get interested and start doing trends, the public does. So,
What year?
it was popular in 1950. They all played ragtime. So yeah, you can ask questions, please. So we have Revival 1A, which I call the 1950s. How did that come about? Well, Pee Wee Hunt recorded the 12th Street Rag. How did this come about? They were in Nashville in about the late spring of 1948. Could not record. You could not go into a recording studio. However, you could make radio transcriptions. And they were doing something for armed forces that was also going to be played around the country. About 3 minutes left for them to do one more track. And he said, oh, why don't we do that silly 12th Street Rag with a do-wag-a-do? They had a piano-shaped object somewhere in the studio. It was about a half step flat from the band. The band did not tune themselves to the piano, so it sounded awful. But they recorded this thing, figuring, ha ha ha, it'll probably never get played. It got played 2 weeks later, all around the country. And the response was amazing. He said, wow, we got to have this 12th Street Rag. It's so much fun. Why do I like this? It's nostalgia. You know who really liked this? Uday Bowman, because he had been just recently acquired the rights to his own piece, which he had sold off. And once their recording got out, how did their recording get out? It was not done in a studio for commercial release. It was done as a transcription. And Capitol had now settled with the Musicians Union, so now they could take this and release it as a single and not cross anybody. Brilliant. And it became the big hit of 1948. And I'm sure there's a bunch of reasons for that. Wave of nostalgia, musical comfort food. These guys come back from the war. They want something to center around, to feel. And this is what I got the sense of from so many people I interviewed long ago, is that it was familiar. It was grandma's house. It was those cartoons that they grew up with. It was something, I liked this because it was fun and it made me smile. And we needed that in 1948. So Lou Bush decided, since 12th Street Rag was doing so well, and he was the A&R guy at Capitol Records, let's try something. In 1949, he recorded Sam's song, as did Bing Crosby with his son. They both recorded that. And it became a hit in 1949. So he decided to do Honky Tonk Piano in 1950. And it was the first long-playing record, 8 tracks at the time, on 10 inches, of ragtime recorded on magnetic tape. So there's this confluence. You have the new style of record, magnetic tape. It was rife for all this. And Honky Tonk Piano It probably sold no more than 100,000 copies, but it was being heard in jukeboxes, the singles that came from it. Lou Bush recorded something like 40 singles over the next decade, most of them ragtime, and he did other forms of music too. And after that, he moved to Warner Brothers. He became Alan Sherman's go-to guy. You know, hello, Mata, hello, Fada. But in the 1950s, he was Joe Finger's car, and he was the guy. So many other artists. You got Paul Lingle, Frankie Carl, Crazy Otto, a guy from Europe, Firehouse Five, my favorite, Johnny Maddox, who we lost last November, Winifred Atwell, Del Wood, and those two guys. We're going to get to those two guys in a minute. What is important, and many more, of course. Firehouse 5+2 got great exposure because most of them, at least the five, not the +2, were Disney artists. So they got occasionally broadcast on Disney, and that was one of the #1 shows. Christmas Day 1951, they did the special where they were pushing Alice in Wonderland. It's the first time they've been on TV. Firehouse 5+2 played Jingle Bells, instant hit and big record. And the one that's up there, the volume 2, that had that great Tiger Rag on it. If anyone's heard Firehouse 5+2 play Tiger Rag, that's joy. And the ragtime revival was underway. #1A. It's a big deal. Those two guys, Billy Rowland, Richard Robin Hyman, they played one guy. His name was Knuckles O'Toole. But these guys came and interrupted everything. The one in the middle, yes, we were rolling along, and in 1955, 56, we got that guitar guy there. Thank you very much. Mr. Jerry Lee Lewis, and of course, little Richard Penniman. These guys upset the balance. And yet, what the guys on the end were doing was essentially boogie-woogie extensions of ragtime in that rhythm and blues. But it caught on. And it was just like 50 years prior. The kids were playing this music, and it was black music, and the parents say, "Turn that piano down." It's just, that's how it was. So it was a repeat. Well, move to Revival 1B, because it did come back thanks to Knuckles O'Toole, which is, for the first couple of albums, it was Billy Rowland, and then it became Dick Hyman. Now, one of the albums, I don't know if this goes to Paris, but one of the albums I didn't have up there was Ragtime Piano Hits, which was issued 4 times, 4 different covers. And that was all the stuff that you'd want to hear. Wild Cherries and Dill Pickles and Down Home Rag, and just, it was a huge hit in 1959 when it was released. So, and on the bottom, we had the first, what I would call the classic artists, the one who weren't trying to do honky-tonk. When I asked Johnny Maddox about this, he said, "There's no such thing as honky-tonk. They're just playing ragtime on bad pianos." But Max Morath is one of his first ventures. The second one, Essay in Ragtime, is Ann Charters. That wasn't her name at the time, but she married Sam Charters, who had founded Folkway Records. So she was one of the first serious attempts at playing Joplin and Lamb, like Joplin and Lamb probably would have intended, more classically. And then Joseph Lamb himself, studying classic ragtime, he was recorded in his home in 1959, a couple years before his death, playing his own material, and you had something of the composer's intent there. And then that last one, that's early 60s, 1962, the Golden Reunion in Ragtime, where you have Eubie Blake, Joe Jordan, and Charlie Thompson, all 3 veterans of the ragtime era. And it wasn't a huge record hit, but it got a lot of radio play because there was a radio version done of this. So they started to move to other media as well. So Revival 1C, it dipped a little bit again, then it started to come back in the early to mid 1960s. Television and popular ragtime presentations. Max Morath, Joanne Castle, who grew up watching Lawrence Welk, and there was Joanne Castle. You know how she got her job? It was on her 19th or 20th birthday, I think it was, on the air. And she had been filling in for Big Tiny Little, who was Lawrence Welk's pianist. And he offered her the job live on the air. She said, okay, and played Dill Pickles. But then there's this gem, which we're going to listen to, which again helped make Ragtime popular, at least in a short verse. That was pretty epic, huh? These guys are dead. You don't have to applaud them. Then the folios. I had all three of those by, I don't know, about 1970, 71 when they were out. Boy, that one on the right, the Ragtime Treasures, that sold for, I think, $4.95. You know what they sell for now on eBay? Hundreds of dollars. I've seen them as low as, even these other two sell for quite a bit. I mean, look at the contents. You got James P. Johnson, Steeplechase Rag, and, oh boy, Frank Losey, Fischler. Over here, Temptation Rag, which is great, Riverside Rag, black and white. This was the stuff. This is what the folios were. So it was becoming available as piano literature again. And Bell and Mills, F.A. Mills, they were making some money from that. Bob Darch and others start holding local festivals. Now we're getting into what we're doing. And Bob was probably the #1 cheerleader in the country for ragtime back in the 1960s through almost to his death, 2004, I think that was. And I played at a few of events that he held. And he had this huge crown piano, which were 5 pedals, that he would haul around with him wherever he went. Florida, Alaska, he played for several years in Nevada. But he would find a place like Sedalia or St. Louis or Columbia, and who was the local guy there? And then he'd have some kind of event to honor him. He had Arthur Marshall in the room, did recordings of Arthur Marshall, and said, look what you've got in your town. Yes?
What were the extra 2 pedals for?
One of them brought down some kind of honky-tonk mandolin bar.
Gas and brake.
Yeah, gas and brake, okay, I don't know. And one of them did some kind of carriage shift or something, but I know, it was a lot of pedals. I played on this thing, and it's a beast. Right, uppercase, okay. All right. I cannot prove it, but I attribute him with the first concept of a ragtime festival. But that, of course, expanded with the goldenrod in the mid-1960s. Trevor Tishner, Dave Jason had something to do with it. It was mostly Trevor's baby. And that was held in St. Louis on the beautiful goldenrod showboat for almost 30 years. So then it's dead again. It's like, what happened? Yeah, there's the festivals are around, but outside of that, in nostalgic venues like the Strader Hotel, or there might be something in Dodge City, or little tourist things, it was suddenly forgotten again. Elton John and Billy Joel came along and upset everything. Vera Brodsky Lawrence, 1970, publishes this extraordinary volume of almost all of Scott Joplin's music. Jerry Vogel was the copyright holder for 3 of the pieces, Searchlight, Rose Leaf, and Fig Leaf. And so those were not in there, so it was called the Collected Piano Works at the time. But still, I got that. When I was 11 years old, I got this, and I started learning right, because I've been learning these pieces off of records, so my mom said, fine, I'll spend the $12 or whatever it was. Not for the hardcover. That includes Treemonisha, but for the rest of it, so. And then, Nonsuch released the 2 albums of Joshua Rifkin, who had been working with Lawrence. Volume 1 in 1970, Volume 2 1972. Started out with Maple Leaf, went right to The Entertainer. Wow. And then, we know what and then is, don't we?
Yeah.
Oh, little thing, okay. We rediscovered ragtime. How did that happen? I know it's a little soft. Anybody? You know this? There we go. This came out, I saw it the day after Christmas, 1973, and my life was already changed by this film. The movie didn't do much more except, it's going to be popular again. And it was. This made it to top 40 radio. This was the exciting part, right here. It was an orchestra. Now, how this came about, we can down a little bit. But what happened is George Roy Hill was making this film, and he heard a nephew of his playing this on the piano, and he had the Rifkin albums. He said, I like that. So he sat down, because George Roy Hill played piano, and said, this is cool, I want it for my film. But then he decided he wasn't going to have time in the editing room to also be playing. He wasn't that good. So he called Gunther Schuller, who had done one of the orchestral recordings by that time, read that book. Gunther Schuller said, I don't have the time, I'll send you some of my scores. Well, who has the time? Well, this Marvin Hamlish guy had just won the Oscar for The Way We Were, so he was sitting pretty, and he came in and rearranged, that's the nice word, some of the music, without knowing it, renamed one of the major pieces, the Sting. Pianists in the 1980s and 90s, we had this saying, oh, Sting, where is thy death? Because of the amount of times we played The Entertainer. But enough of that. So thanks. Joplin did not always receive his due. His name was clearly heard at the 1974 Academy Awards. That's a pretty big deal. So what happened then? Treemonisha, Houston Opera, under Gunther Schuller, came to light. That was pretty awesome. So ragtime was on its way back. A second ragtime revival, clearly now, through the rest of the decade, and maybe into the early 1980s. Joplin-centric albums, there were so many. E. Power Biggs did it on the harpsichord. There was plugged-in Joplin and turned-on Joplin. They were done on synthesizers. Emerson, Lake and Palmer Keith Emerson did a version of Maple Leaf, which has guitar and it had mallet instruments in it. It was on a rock and roll album. Emerson, Lake and Palmer works. We heard Ragtime everywhere. Lady Gaga actually was playing Maple Leaf, but I mean that's a later time. But everybody knew this and it was being included. So it was a revival. 1974, they had the Ozark Music Festival down at the fairgrounds. And it was a disaster. The organizer said, it's going to be a folk music festival. And then they had every big rock group in the world come here. And the people near the fairgrounds, their houses were being inundated by people peeing on the lawns and sleeping everywhere. And it was bigger than Woodstock. And that was a problem. And then a week later, and Dave, you were here. They were not terribly receptive. Some people were kind of wary of any musicians coming into town, right?
Well, we had this one minute of a very interesting interaction. I arrived a couple of days early for the first festival, not knowing exactly what was going to be happening, offering to volunteer to help set it up. And I literally drove into this crowd of a heavy festival thinking, this is a bigger deal than I thought it was going to be. So I had to figure out quick that this was not really anything for us. And then I figured out that there was a lot of resentment about all that had been done to the town and trash. And here we are, oh, we're going to have another music festival 2 days later. So it was kind of
It was an iffy situation. But all the guys were here. UB Blake was here. Terry Waldo was here. You had just finished with the New England Conservatory and some of those early recordings. So it was exciting thing. Of course, Dave Jason, Trevor Tishner were here. I know I'm missing a bunch of people. Dick Hyman? No, he wasn't, but Bolcom, Bill Bolcom. So many names. And that started the festivals other than the Goldenrod, and more festivals were to come after that. Saloons in vogue again. One of my first jobs working at Disneyland, which has always had ragtime. I've done a seminar on Disney and ragtime and why that's essential. That was good. Endless folios in print. Of course, we did a whole concert last night about two of the best of them, which, and there's a third one they didn't mention, classic piano rags. It had Joplin and Lamb and Matthews and Scott and all that. The Pink Book is what we called it. And those three folios from Dover were marvelous, but as the decade came on and more things came into copyright, there were more and more releases. And I loved every one. In 1980, we got Jelly Roll Morton, thanks to the late James DePogny. Tired of saying late, these guys just dropping off. But that was good because we could see how Jelly Roll played. That actually came out in 3 or 4 editions as corrections were added. But it was nice to have these folios. But some of them were, I don't know, they were full of old-time songs, or they had secondary arrangements which were not so great. So not all the folios, like the All-American Ragtime series, were all that great. Then the stamp was issued. That's when we made it. You should, I guess the rules are that you do have to be dead to be on a stamp. Although Muppets have done it. Were they ever alive? Tower Records, one of my favorite haunts in LA and later in DC, put it into the classification of classical music, a lot of this, or Americana. If you wanted to find Max Morath, he was in an Americana section. They didn't know where to put it before, but now, because of Joshua Rifkin and Vera Lawrence, we have this classical music. They have defined it. Said, okay, well, it's important. So Tower Records, no longer in business, it's important. I thought that was wonderful. Papers are written and degrees are obtained. So, well, it's true. My degree was one I sort of invented, American ethnomusicology. Ethnomusicology is usually study of all other cultures. But what I convinced University of North Colorado to help me with when I was at Fort Lewis was the ethnic contributions to ragtime. What came from what country to do what. And a lot of the opinions have changed since, well, my opinion in particular. But there were other people obtaining degrees in this and talking about it and doing some serious writing. Not the least notable of them, Ed Berlin, who did a great book on the social aspects of ragtime and the era. Reflections, okay. New books, new research, many of them supplanted parts of, they all played ragtime, including Tishner and Jason's Rags and Ragtime, released twice, 1978, 1988. I don't want to go over here, so. One surviving entity from an era became a celebrity again. Yubi. Can anyone tell me what you're seeing on the left?
100 years.
Gregory Hines, February of 1979, Saturday Night Live. Yubi Blake was the musical guest. He got a 12-minute segment, did 3 pieces, closing out with I'm Just Wild About Harry, played in waltz, and then in rag. But what was funny, and Terry was talking to me about this last week, Terry Waldo, had been with him for a while. By this time, 1979, he was 4 years or so from death at 96. He's 92 here. He was starting to fade, and he was sleeping more and more each day. He'd have some 10, 11, 12-hour days. And this is a behind-the-scenes thing many of you will have not known about. He would only be on when it was time to be on. The rest of the time, it's just, oh, whatever. So they did dress rehearsal. They always do dress rehearsal at 8:30, so they know what they're going to cut at 11:30 if they need to cut something or if it's not going to work. And Yubi was just sort of there. He was in a wheelchair and he was rolled up to the piano and Lauren wanted to cut it. He said, this is not going to work. This is just a doddering old man who can barely play the piano. And Hines begged and pleaded, said, please, he will be there, I promise you. And then it's about 12:30, I think, when he went on. It was late in the show. But as soon as they announced his name, he just bounded out of the wheelchair and went to the piano. And he did he said, yeah, you know, I used to play this song. You know who I am, don't you? And Greg says, yes, I'm doing a musical about you on Broadway, of course, Yubi Blake. So, and it was a marvelous performance, and he got back in the chair. Terry said it was a bizarre thing to watch. So, but he was famous again, and he was our one connection by 1980 to this era. And then we lost him in 1983. Revival 2, festivals, events, interest waned by the late 1980s, and there were fans trying to keep it alive, including here. And then this, and eventually the West Coast Festival, became the 2 major places, and there were some smaller festivals, many of them dead now. Indianapolis had one. Eau Claire, Wisconsin, that's now dead. They had the Bashes up in Toronto. I went to the last of those. That was 1989. They're long gone. So twice a year you could hear ragtime with other people.
Muscatine, Iowa.
Muscatine, yeah, that's right. But that's a more recent festival.
That's what?
It's a more recent festival. Looks to be dead. I didn't have much hope. I had been playing, by this time I'd left Durango. I was in Alexandria, Virginia in the late 80s playing at a place called the Fish Market. And they had 5 of us there. Mr. Ray Giovanni, who owned it, called us his stable of ragtime thoroughbreds. Ron Trotta, Daryl Ott, Steve Stubby Heist. Stubby, he had a leg missing from a motorcycle accident, but there were 6 of us playing it there. By 1992, no more. So it was sad. I thought, well, there went my chance. I was born 5 years too late to capitalize on this. Then, Revival 3. How did this come about? I think many of you already know the answers. Ragtime fans, nerds discovered bulletin boards on the internet. A bulletin board, you had to get CompuServe and log into CompuServe and then go search for a certain bulletin board. And all you had were these vague texts of things about what are you wearing and what rag are you playing. So, yeah, the internet was still nefarious then, but fortunately, somebody got smart and they invented a language and a new connection, the World Wide Web. And by 1994, the web was starting to get some interest. The HTML language was great because we could have some way of creating pages that we could emphasize things through italics or bold or show pictures. So having a palatable language was important, especially for ragtime nerds. Ragtime-focused websites appear. Mine goes back to 1997, but there were actually a few online. Martin Spitznagel was one of the first to discover me. He said, "Where'd you come from? Where'd you come from?" It was quite fun, so I engaged, and I originally just wanted to sell cassettes. I couldn't make CDs back then, just to sell music, but people started asking questions because I put out a few little blurbs on this song or that song. Well, what about this? Well, what about that? So it evolved between 1997 and 2002 from trying to sell music to try and get interest in the music, and that's where I've been ever since. So the internet was a godsend. Universities and libraries put collections online. One of the first, the Lester Levy collection. There was a Duke University collection, University of South Florida. Now there's so many of them. Indiana Harmony, Library of Congress has put a lot of stuff. New York Public Library, and they're all available through the links on my site if you want to see more of these. But this is the first time I've seen a lot of these pieces of music, especially with color covers. And most of them actually on the Levy site were rescanned several years later in a much higher definition. Problem back then, since you were in dial-up, was bandwidth. So when I put out my music, as many people did, it was in MIDI format because it's very small. And your results would vary because it played back whatever sound you had on your computer. But now bandwidth it's cheap pretty much, so we can put out WAV files if we want. They're going to play instantly, and those are huge. The Disney Bono law became somewhat of an issue, and it froze the copyrights at 1922 being the last one you could do. So if you wanted to put out Rhapsody in Blue or certain stride pieces, sometimes the music guys would come after you. And they would even come after, sometimes at a festival. I think that has been handled by many of them. That they say, you can't play this, you can't play that. Now, by the way, this year, 1923 became available, and next year on January 1st, Rhapsody in Blue will be available. So that's great. But that copyright law was a bugaboo for a lot of people, and it made it expensive to put out CDs. But we've lived with it. Frederick, you should know from that, right? Yeah. Okay, nod. So, bulletin boards gave way to social media. Like, there was MyFace or something. Yeah, I know, MySpace. MP3s, M4As, those are new formats, compressed formats. The good and bad, faster streaming of recordings, but requisite issues because easy distribution of recordings without regard for the artist and their feelings and the hard work they put into it. The M4As are the version used on iPods and iPhones. The MP3s are a bit more common and will work on pretty much anything. In fact, this year I have actually gone to that. I have USB sticks of some of my older material and newer material put into MP3 format. So you just plug the USB in your car or your computer or your television or whatever, phone. That's how it's done now. But that was a big deal. And this has helped with the revival. But probably two of the biggest, Yahoo groups and Facebook. And we have at least 6 or 7 really strong ragtime groups on Facebook. So we get along and talk quite often. And we brought up a lot of great issues and learned stuff. I know Brian here is constantly sharing new research on Joplin and his colleagues, which he does on Facebook, and it is such an important service. And we have Ed Berlin, it connects us all.
And the awesome thing about this is Facebook gives us something akin to instant peer review. Because if I come up with something or find something interesting, or I think it's interesting and I'm a little bit curious about it, I don't really know, I could post it to Facebook and say, hey, what do we got here? What is this? And inside of a day, people all over the world are talking about this and raising questions or providing answers or both. And it's essentially peer review, and it's instantaneous. You do sort of have to filter it because sometimes what gets suggested or whatever isn't necessarily correct. But it's something we've never had before, and it's
Take
amazing.
that up to Fred also. He's gonna
Yes.
comment. It's easier with the mic. So we can all hear. Thank you. And then you hang on to that for a minute.
To mention that the person is here who is the administrator, probably the most popular of the Ragtime Facebook pages, John Reed Torres.
Yes.
So,
He's out playing.
He has a staff thing.
You can't.
Okay. But the other great thing, YouTube. And again, YouTube sort of skirts some copyright laws because people post anything they want. Well, there's a lot of ragtime, but they say, I am not the owner of this for copyright reasons, so whatever, it's not about. And how they get around the copyright thing is commercials are inserted into your video. It's not a big deal, I think. Postmodern Jukebox, one of my favorite groups, Scotty here, he has taken new music and he plays it in swing or ragtime or whatever, and they've made a big splash. And I get asked all the time. So I say the internet has helped with the ragtime revival. However, we are still here. How do we disseminate the music responsibly? That's, in other words, don't give everything out for free because a lot of these artists work for a living to support the ragtime habit, but we would like something for it. In a sensitive era, how do we reconcile some of the currency and liability of rag history? We recently had a youth who put together a questionable cover for a new piece, but using stereotypes from a century before, and he didn't quite understand it. So this is, how do we reconcile just looking back, say, well, they did it then, why don't we do it now? We have to be able to explain that that was currency of the time, but not now. How do we get younger audiences? We have younger players. You've seen them. Last weekend in Oxford, I saw a lot of younger players, and there were more that wanted to be there, but we had limits. So many. Listen, Oliver Moore is amazing. Daniel Savigny's been a year at Berkeley doing some amazing things. These guys are going to keep the music alive, but we can't keep the music alive if there's nobody in the seats to play it to. So that's what. Is there a way to rebrand this music or make the term ragtime palatable again? That's a tough one. Terra Verde, they rebranded it, but it's also a slightly different style, as was told to us yesterday. So what do we do about this? Do we need another Sting or a Broadway show or a movie? And yes, I have been for several years working on a Broadway musical, and it's still going to be another year before it's out, on the life of Scott Joplin, using overlay melodies on some of his original stuff. And it's tough. I'm getting a dramaturg involved pretty soon. So maybe that'll help, and I'll be not the next Lin-Manuel Miranda, but we'll have something. Because Freddie does hip-hop. He's white, yeah, okay. No, Lottie, not Freddie. So how do we cultivate more performance venues? Where is it going to be? So those are the questions. Will it ever be cool again? So you want to start, Fred?
just because I happen to have a microphone here.
Well-
Doesn't mean,
does anybody have ideas? This is what,
I've got a comment for you.
all right.
Some months ago, a couple of years ago, I was taking at university a history of jazz class, and when the professor found what I do, he had me teach the ragtime section, which was fun. And it was all early 20s non-music majors, most of whom were well versed in the current pop music stuff, but weren't familiar at all with ragtime. And, you know, I did the typical thing of, you know, playing some YouTube videos of this is what this is and this is what that is. And then I asked their impressions after. And the comment absolutely blew me away. The comment was, wow, I've always heard this music. I've always liked this music, but I never knew it was ragtime. I thought, my God, we've got work to do.
Any other thoughts? Okay. Dave.
Yeah, I've been asking the question of my interview guests on radio since 1981, and since then just in casual conversation, just as a point of reference to see what the contour is in the timeline. Wherever this person I'm talking to happens to be from, I ask the question, is there at least one place you can go reliably hear ragtime once a day, once a week, once a month, regularly go, you know, be able to hear ragtime, no matter where they live, New York, a big city, small town, in a central region, around a big town, or suburbs? The question has invariably been no. And there are a few bumps in the road. I mean, we do in San Francisco have Pier 23, which manages to have a lot of ragtime at least once a month, to my knowledge. But in general, the scale just has not changed in some 35 years or so. And this, for me, is really a wonderful goal. It's here next to the last point on the slide. You know, where are the venues? I would like to see that as the big result. Not just you can get recordings and go online, but actually hear it live like we do at these very few ragtime festivals.
Anybody else?
I'll add one comment. You know, with I lead the Featuring Ragtime Orchestra, for those who don't know, and about 95% of our programming is silent movie shows. But 5% of our programs are ragtime concerts. So obviously, there's an audience that wants to experience something from this period, but you have to find ways to sneak ragtime in, because you can have an audience go to see Charlie Chaplin or Buster Keaton, which may be a hell of a lot more mainstream than Scott Joplin, and then you can play, oh yeah, here's the theme from The Sting, it's The Entertainer. Throw in your other classic rags and your one steps, your two steps, your other dance musics that we all love. But that's the way that I found a lot of audiences will then react, is you sort of get them in with something else that might be more familiar, and then you introduce ragtime, and then suddenly they love it, and now they're looking to hear more of it, and then they become ragtime fans, and then you're connoisseurs.
What I'm looking for from this, one more comment. I want everybody to hear it. It's important.
This is, I guess, more of a question. I'm from Rochester, New York, and in Rochester we have the Eastman School of Music.
I actually just acquired the entire orchestra collection of the Eastman Theater.
Yes.
All 4,000 pieces.
Yeah, and we, in addition to that, we have the Dryden Theater, which is part of the George Eastman Museum, which does a lot of the silent movies and playing that. We also have a 10-day International Jazz Festival that's coming up in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And I'm wondering what the place is for cities like Rochester that have music festivals, that have, that have venues that can be used here, that need perhaps just more a little PR, or perhaps at Eastman that part of their jazz program they could emphasize on their student programs that they're going to do a ragtime thing. I don't know if Eastman even does that. I know some of you are Eastman alums. So, but I'm wondering, at least in the larger, we're not huge, but in the larger cities, that there can be some targeted energy put to those organizations that in their own PR could say, you know, ragtime. I mean, just even use the word.
It depends really on a couple of different factors. Certainly you go to a larger city, they're probably going to have either a college performing series or an actual performing arts center. What we've found is you have to find the right person who's willing to take the risk, because ragtime in this, at least the performing arts market, is a very risky thing for an audience, for a group. You know, if an orchestra or a solo pianist comes in and they say, oh, we're playing ragtime, the thing that the venue's going to care about is how many butts can we put in seats and how much money can we make and not go in the red.
Yeah.
You can then, you know, change that to be, you know, let's find something like a postmodern jukebox that takes this music and transforms it in a way that it can connect to somebody, or in a similar vein, silent movie shows. Okay, people like the nostalgia of movies. Heck, you go to any major symphony, they're doing Jurassic Park, they're doing Harry Potter, they're doing all of that. And then you have ragtime alongside, and you can really, you know, put the emphasis during the show of, this was America's music, this was fun, and if you present it in a fun and engaging way,
Yeah.
then the audience will get it, the venue will get it, and not to say you sort of trick them into a ragtime program, but you kind of have to, and then they say, oh my God, this is fantastic, can we please have it back, and let's do something different.
I have to move to Sean Howard.
So anybody who has any ideas, please spread this around and ask the questions. You can find groups on Facebook, find my site, I'll direct you to them. I'm Professor Bill on Facebook, but also the Ragtime Players, there's a Ragtime. Just look up the word ragtime, you'll find these sites, and get to us and comment to us what your ideas are. Write to me, go to my site, and on the main page you'll see my head, click on that. That'll get you email. Get ahead, email me, is what it says. We want to make this more than coming to Sedalia once a year and going out to Sacramento once a year. It's not enough. This to be played. We have classical music stations. There is one station on Sirius, I believe, which plays considerable amount of ragtime, but it's just, let's make it popular again, however we can do it.